Hey everyone, today we're going over logging in .NET Core, getting started at least in this video. So next videos can be about applying better structure in the logs, and then a video afterwards can even be about getting those logs into a better monitoring tool like Application Insights. So if you're not subscribed already, please do, so you'll be notified about the upcoming videos, which will be potentially more useful for your project. Let's get started. One of the major benefits of using a stable framework like .NET Core is there is already a very good logger built in and already configured. We'll see, let's say you're not content, not happy with the current configuration, you can access this by builder.logging. Then maybe you can add your own configuration, add filters, and much more. Just so you know, I'm not going to customize it. You can even build your own custom logger on top of the default logger. I'm not going to cover that in these videos. I think that's with the logging provider, the logging factory. In future videos, of course, we will be using another logger provider, but more on that later. How do you use this logger? So we're now in the program CS. You can already access the logger by typing app.logger and then the log level. So either you can just type log and specify the log level, the message, and you can even add some arguments, some data that will then be output in the log. But more commonly it's used by typing app.logger and then specifically log warning. Then you only have to pass your log message, and you can of course use things like string interpolation or just concatenate the strings yourself. But that's not actually a good practice if you want to later on have structured logging and if you want to better monitor your logs. I would advise against string interpolation and all those things, because once it's all stringified, your monitoring tool will not be able to tell which parts were the original flat text string and which parts consist of the variable values. So then it's all just one flat text, instead of when you're using this passing arguments, then you still have the monitoring tool can still have a notion of what were the variables, what were the values, and use that to structurally visualize your logs. That was a bit too much of an explanation about that, because we'll cover that in more detail later on. What is important for now are these log levels. So you can have log warning, log information, log critical, debug error, trace, and there's a certain priority or hierarchy in these. So critical would be the most severe, then error, then warning, then information, then debug, then trace, if I'm not mistaken. Debug is more for development purposes, and trace is more for, I think, system logs. Like if your ASP.NET Core project is starting, you'll see all kinds of, and you enable the trace logging, then you might see a lot of details about how your application is compiling, starting, and all of those things. So you likely don't want to see all those details about ASP.NET Core starting up. So you can filter what the console outputs, what you see, so your console doesn't get polluted by less interesting information, less interesting to you. Let's check out the app settings, where you can filter those logs based on a log level. So default is set to information, so by default we'll see the information logs, even if some other NuGet package would output an information log, for example. You would see that in the console at the bottom here. You already see info, so that's an information log output by starting the ASP.NET Core API, web API. Just telling you that we started up correctly. You see a few warning logs, that's what I manually put out. Danger, let's probably have to restart to see. Yeah, now you see these parameters and true here, which is string interpolated. Okay, so back to the log levels. Let's say you only want to see, so if you specify a log level here, information or warning, it's going to log the information logs and everything that has a higher priority, like warning, error, and critical. Just so you know that you don't have to comma separate all the log levels you want to see. You can even fine-grain that. You can fine-grain that even more by being more specific. Yeah, kind of overwriting. If you don't do that, that's fine. It's just gonna look at the default log level. For example, here it's setting the ASP.NET Core logs to warning. So it's gonna filter out the warning, error, and critical, only show those. And I'm assuming that's those are logs typical to the ASP.NET Core framework. So yeah, assuming when something goes wrong, it will let you know. And then you can even fine-grain it more. Let's say you're using a database entity framework core, or this could be anything, and you want a different log level for that. So want to set it to debug, so we're logging more than we would by default. Then you can do that as well. This is the app settings.development, so this is of course applying to your development environment. So when you're running locally as well. Then you have the app settings, that's more meant for your live or your production version. It's a common practice to then raise the log level. That's up to you, of course. If it's your first publish, maybe you will still want to see more, but once you're confident in your production application, you can raise this level to warning, so you'll only see warning and above. Again, you can tweak this if you want more, if you want it differently. Okay, so next up would be, we had log levels, dependency injection. So I used it like this in the program CS, but if we want to use it in the controller, we can simply access it by using the iLogger interface and passing through a category name. It's mostly set to the class name. So yeah, why would you do that? Because you want to know where the log is produced, where the log is coming from. If you wouldn't do that, or you would set that to something nonsensical, you might not be able to figure out what is happening, what's producing that log. And so you inject this iLogger, and then you can just use it similarly by typing .log warning or log information and all that, just like that. So I just said I'm manually logging here. That just means that I put a log statement myself. Yeah. There's also ways to, let's for example, you want to log every database interaction or every request that comes in or response that goes out, or those kind of things. You probably don't want to have to write a log statement yourself everywhere, so you can configure those more efficiently. Let's for example, you're adding a DB context from Entity Framework, and then you can, for example, enable some logs, and then you can filter out the log levels you want to see, like I showed you. I think it's entityframework.core. Maybe you need to have to add database.command or something. You can fine grain it how you like. That's a simple example for the database logging. And the nice thing, because the iLogger is built in, the logger is built into ASP.NET Framework Core, is if you use things like add DB context, it's also going to automatically use that iLogger. So it's not like you have to pass your logging configuration or anything like that. Kind of happens by the framework handles all that. Okay, so I mentioned request logging, for example. That's where it gets a little more tricky. Let's say you want to log every time a request comes in or a response goes out from your controller, so like incoming. So that would then happen as probably as a middleware on the request cycle. It could log whatever it is inside the body, and then before a response goes out, you can maybe log the response that's going out, because that could be consisting of database data and you just want to see if everything went well and as expected. Oops, sorry, messing up with my video program. What's tricky about request logging is you can, as of recently, you can simply just say app.use HTTP logging, and that will then log the requests. Let's try that in a bit. You can, at the top, configure that logging. For example, you can set the requests bodies, body sizes, and or add extra headers or something. Log headers or something. You can do all of those things. I'm not going to do that right now because I don't really use this kind of middleware logging. Okay, I produced some logs, but I didn't see anything, and that is because I didn't use this line. I didn't add this line for the HTTP logging middleware. It was by default probably set to warning. Whether that's a default value or it's looking at this, I can't tell you. Anyway, we override that with the information log level. And now we see the request logging output. You can fine tune that a little bit, configure what you want to see from the request and what you don't want to see. Also see some redacted information. You can probably alter the visibility of that. Redacted means it's sensitive information, so it automatically hides it. What we now see is just a long list of mainly HTTP headers, which I don't find too useful in most of the cases. Also see the response, so that's the request, that's the response, but you don't actually see too much relevant data for developing purposes. For example, if you want to improve, just if you're bug tracking or something and you want to see exactly what was passed in the request headers and the route parameters and the request body, everything that was passed, you can't really get it out this way, not easily. And the major problem with this approach is I often get the question, people want to log the request body or the response body. Fortunately, that's not that easy. They even give you a warning. They even give you a warning over here. Logging a request body has performance implications as it requires buffering the entire request body up to request body log limit. So you basically, the request body and the response body are streams, which you would then have to read into memory and then pass along, then make it, then just pass along the stream. But you're reading out the response body then just to log it, what's inside, and then, which has performance implications because you are reading the stream into memory. While that actually already happens when you enter into a controller endpoint. So now the request body is read, so you would double read out the request body or request response. So that's not wise to do, and that's also why I don't really bother with these request logger. Just know you can use it if you want to know more about the headers. I strayed a bit off topic. That was a bit beyond getting started with logging. Just know the possibilities. Also, you can customize the logger. Let's say you want other colors or slightly different structure. You can do that. You can write your own custom logger on top of the iLogger, or you can write even your own logging provider and all that. It's highly customizable, but there are already great solutions out there, so we don't need to do this ourselves. Just know you can. So the next section would be when to log. Do you want to log everything all the time, or do you want to log nothing? There's probably an in-between. Let's take a look at this post method. Let's say I used my Swagger to post some new weather forecast data. The first thing we're checking in here is whether the request data, the summary value is not null or white space, and if the list of summaries already contains the newly posted summary. If that's the case, I wrote a log warning saying the summary already exists. That would be a duplicate, and we refuse to add duplicates. Let's say we don't enter, so we would call this an unhappy path. We know it's possible. It's nothing unexpected, but it's not allowed. It's not what we want, so it's an unhappy scenario. So we're writing a log warning. It's not that severe, it's nothing critical, it's nothing unexpected, so we won't be using log error or log critical. It's a bit up to you, but this is a common practice to then log warning. A better example might be let's say certain user wants to get his or her user profile from the database, and we get the user ID posted in this endpoint, and we try to query the database for that user ID to get that relevant user info. Let's say it's a malicious attempt. Someone is just trying to get some information. Then we could log here user not found, and probably also log the user ID that was attempted to query with. So like user ID as a argument. Yeah, of course, that's not a variable. So that would be a better, and then we want to know, is this a malicious attempt or is this a user that is still logged in, but we already removed him or her from the database, that there's something not right. Then we could see that in the logs once we have proper monitoring tools set up. Or if we just ourselves we make a typo in the user ID, for example, then we could probably reflect it in the log statement and correct our attempt. So that's an unhappy path, and then below we have the happy path. So let's say we don't hit this unwanted scenario, then we just add the request body summary, since we know it's not null and it's not a duplicate. And then we could, just for the administrator or whoever, we could state the obvious and say, oh, we successfully added the summary. Stating the obvious, I say, because it's expected that this code runs without any problems. So that's not necessary. But you may do that if you just want to be very, how do you say it? Let's say you're just debugging and you want to know, did we actually reach this point? Then we could just say something like, adding went fine or something. Let's say we're running some kind of background service worker or something. Then we want to have a few status updates about the progress. But this is less necessary than the than this warning. So that's more about when to log. I wouldn't recommend logging everything all the time in successful execution paths. If you in an unhappy path, it could be useful to log more about the request body, for example, the summary and maybe the user ID who did it, to get more insight of why we did not get to the expected path. That's just my opinion, of course. Another reason why you wouldn't want to log everything all the time is because you're just going to pollute your logging statements, and you'll really have to dig into those to spot potential problems, to actual problems. So you want to keep that manageable. Then the final part of this video would be what to log. So as I mentioned, it's useful to know in an unexpected path, in an unhappy path, what data was put in and why we got into the to derive the reason for why we got into the unexpected state. In those cases, it's often the more the better. Yeah, it has to be relevant, of course. But you would want to see for example, who posted this, what they posted, and what data they filled in, what they didn't fill in. So sometimes, for example, if the summary is null or empty, it's going to show then, oh yeah, it's probably the reason we went into the unhappy path. So you can just quickly see that. Then it's also useful, but that's more technical. For example, yeah, I already mentioned it, the user ID. That could also be useful to follow the path that the user took, but not just for this function, but let's say right before this post they tried to get the weather results, and before that they authenticated and all that stuff. Then you can reflect the user ID in the logs, so you can, in a sorted by datetime, you can then see what actions the user took. So that adding context data is useful. It's also, I would say, this category name is also a bit of, you could see that as context data, like which class produced that logging statement, but you probably want to have more than that. A trace ID, for example, would be used similarly as I just explained with the user ID, to follow all the actions the user took and what path they took to lead up to an unsuccessful scenario, for example. So out of the box we don't get too much information. We get kind of which class produced the log and then the log itself. But it would be cool to have more detailed info, for example, even which method produced which action in this case produced the log, and at what time, for example. You don't see that in the log. How long it took for example, the user adding a new weather forecast. Did that request take way too long, or was it really quick? That's all interesting information. To add all that information in, as I mentioned before, you could write your own custom logger to slightly alter the structure, or you could use an already existing logger, for example Serilog, which is commonly used to take control over your logs, to apply a good structure, and yeah, just to take control overall. So that's going to be next video, is about how to set up and configure Serilog. So please do subscribe so you'll be notified when that video comes out. And the sooner we're at 500 subscribers, the sooner I can get feedback from you guys directly by using the YouTube features to post messages. Yeah, more like status messages, where I can ask you guys questions about what you want to see or where to improve or all that good stuff. I'll see you in the next video.